I hope everybody can hear me okay. I am Jenny Poon. I'm the founder of Cahoots. I'm gonna get my screen going here for a second. Hold on. And I'm here to talk to you about building inclusive organizations and how to do it. So I'm gonna tell you the story of Cahoots, how we came about shifting into an inclusive workspace and what we've learned from it and how you really can do this on your own as well. And you don't have to do it from the start. So a little bit about Cahoots. Cahoots is a shared workspace. We've been around for 10 years. We're a purpose-driven workspace. We provide entrepreneur support from workspace, obviously, a community, as well as incubation programs. Level Up program is what we have that helps entrepreneurs from early stage to all the way up to scaling. And we started Cahoots, my husband and I there, Odin started Cahoots as a bootstrapped organization. It literally was born out of the recession, out of a need for us to find community and other entrepreneurs that were looking to support each other and learn from each other, much like most co-working spaces across the nation. And over time, we learned that we really could learn so much from each other. And one of those biggest pieces that I've learned over the years is how important a diverse team is to growing an organization. And not just a diverse team, but a diverse ecosystem in entrepreneurship. And so that led to us being named #4 co-working space in the nation by Inc.com, really because we were rooted in focusing on how we support entrepreneurs and how we build a more inclusive ecosystem for all entrepreneurs in general. So I want to tell you about a pivotal moment that changed the course of our entire business at Cahoots. In 2014, 4 years into our existence, I looked across our community. At that point, we had about 150 entrepreneurs in our space, grown individually, one at a time. Each new entrepreneur that came into our space, we nurtured, and they created more jobs and hired more people. And at some point around 2014, we hit about 150 entrepreneurs. And it was amazing, right? I looked across our space and I saw all these entrepreneurs that came in early, really scared, and now suddenly we're so confident in the work that they were doing, and we're thriving, right? And I looked across this community, this big open space, people growing, and I noticed one thing that was kind of wild, and that was we had grown this great community, but 95% of our entrepreneurs were middle-class white men, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love my middle-class white men, but that is not me, right? And across Arizona, where we are located, that's not the community that lives outside of our four walls. And so I really looked at how do we shift this, right? Coming from a family of immigrants who started businesses, I knew the path to wealth was through entrepreneurship. And why was it everybody that was in our space at that moment only middle-class white men, right? Like, why were they the only ones that were able to access this path to entrepreneurship? When I knew that other people deserved and were just as capable of being successful in this space. And so we took a moment to really kind of identify what was causing the barriers here. And this, I think, is applicable if you are a leader of an organization, if you're a worker of an organization, an employee of an organization, if you're an entrepreneur, as well as if you are in a place of support, right? As an advisory board member, anyone who has a place in a position of power, you have the ability to make these magnificent changes that can change an organization altogether. So I want to kind of go through our steps so that other people can learn how we did it and apply additional techniques. So foundationally, for you to build an inclusive organization, you need to believe in three things. One of those is that everybody has their own unique lived experiences, and those unique experiences are actually blessings. The second piece is diverse teams perform better, and homogeny is the antithesis of innovation. So if you believe those three things, you know that inclusivity and diversity in the workplace and in leadership is highly important. And so I don't need to state this because I feel like a majority of people know this. It's more of how do we implement new techniques to be able to build an inclusive ecosystem and support more people in their regular work environment. So racially, ethnically diverse teams perform 35% better than their counterparts. Same with gender diverse teams. I think these stats go all over the place, but what we hear all the time from even Silicon Valley companies is how do we do that? We know that the numbers make sense in terms of having a diverse leadership team and a diverse workforce, but how do we actually execute upon that? How do we shift our culture if we've already gone so far, right? Like 90% of our population is already middle-class white men. How do we start to shift that? And so here we go into this, right? I hear this all the time. Jenny, I'm a middle-class white man. I'm that dude that you were talking about before. I get it, but how do I make that change, right? What do I do as a person in power and in a position of power to start to make that change? And there's 4 steps for me that we went through. One of them is setting the intention. The second is measuring the impact, integrating the work, and then elevating those that you bring in. And there's specific pieces around that, and it started with us in terms of intention, really starting with like defining what that means for us. What does inclusivity mean to us, and how do we live that authentically, right? Again, rooted in that position of, I know that we would do better if we had more diverse perspectives in the conversation. From little things like, I grew up in an immigrant family. If I sat in a room and shared the great learnings of like Buddhist beliefs, these are great things that could be learned in terms of management. But those things often aren't talked about if you never experienced those things growing up. And so like being able to bring those people to the table and welcome them to the table and take their ideas and build a shared vision is where we started, right? So we batted around a few different ideas. What does it look like for us to build a more inclusive workspace? And we defined that in a mission statement. So we shifted our mission statement, which I guess more or less we actually created a mission statement because we really didn't have one. And then we shifted our tagline. And our tagline before was like a co-working space for creatives. And it shifted into a purpose-driven workspace, an inclusive and purpose-driven workspace. And we got buy-in from our team around that. And that was a whole session with our team to discuss, right? Like what do we all agree on that this is the vision for our organization and what we all collectively want to work towards. Another piece that we really worked on was sharing stories, right? Like I have a ton of stories around how I grew up with my parents starting a restaurant and how those experiences have impacted the work that I do today. I think stories and sharing your lived experiences are such an important piece of storytelling, as well as helping people understand that life that you live and how so very different it is, but also how so very important it is. The stories of how my husband grew up also in an immigrant family, but grew up in a community that was all brown. And so when he first came here to the US and became a minority, quote unquote, what that felt like for him, and even for our daughter who's growing up as a very proud brown girl. Like what does that future look like for her in the world that we live in today? And the more and more we talked about that, we realized that other people were starting to understand our perspective. And so the second to the last bullet here is check your bias, right? Like we all come from a different upbringing and we all have different biases. And so being able to come to the table knowing that you are seeing the world from a completely different lens, and that's okay. And so we set that foundation of conversation. And then the last piece there is sharing the stats around this, right? So there's so much that can be said about storytelling, but what's really impactful, at least in a business and leadership role, is like, how does this play out in terms of stats, right? Like, how does this play out in terms of the workforce's ability to move towards the direction of creating more product, right? Tying all of those things together was really, really important. So these are the things that we changed. We went from a collaborative space for creatives to an inclusive, purpose-driven workspace. And then we also, everywhere we went, integrated our mission, which was to be a safe place for all entrepreneurs to thrive. Regardless of race, age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, this is the place where you can feel safe in growing your business, as well as be successful in it, because there's a nurturing environment for all of the different ideas. So this is where we started. And it's one thing to say it and paste it on your wall. I mean, I think that's an easy step to moving things forward, but it's another thing to truly like live it. And that's a piece that is the most important, because people can see through it if it's fake, right? You got to be authentic, you have to live it, you have to believe it, which leads to measuring, right? When you're working on any kind of goal as a leader of an organization or working within an organization, you have goals to set. And if you talk to anybody in government and you talk about measuring economic impact or measuring your diversity metrics and things like that, they get super scared because that feels like tokenism. Like, let's just start checking the boxes of how many people of color we can put on this panel. The reality is, if you don't measure, you don't know where your baseline is, and you don't know if you're doing well, right? And so we sat down and we literally counted how many people in our office was middle-class white men, and that's how we got to our baseline, right? And that's when we knew that there was a problem, because the reality is, outside of our four walls, the world doesn't look like that. And so we first started working on measuring like that piece, and then how do we shift the male female, the gender ratio. That was our first like low-hanging fruit to tackle. And we did that by really immersing ourselves in those communities. And just like I think an earlier session, they talked about really understanding who your audience is. I was very fortunate, obviously, to be a threefer, like a woman, a person of color, and oftentimes one of the youngest people on a panel. So I have the lived experience to understand that, but that doesn't mean that I fully understand the full experience of a person that comes from immense poverty, or a person or a woman, a Black woman, right? Like, the daily lives of what she lives is very different than what I live. And so to spend the time and listen, and that looks like, what does that look like? That looks like joining boards where you can participate deeply in the work of moving inclusion forward, or equity forward. It looks like joining membership groups like NABO or Girls in Tech, or at least in the women's group, these women's initiatives, Empower Phoenix, right? Like, these groups that solely focus on that, but also allow you to understand. That means the chambers, right? Like, join your local chamber. Even as a white person, you can do that, and you can start to understand the barriers that come with being an underrepresented person, learning to enter, or like moving into leadership roles, and what comes with those experiences. A good example of what is very different from my experience than your typical other person, non person of color experience, is I grew up in an immigrant family, and so I always had this barrier around debt. I was always told never to take out a bank loan, never to borrow any money. You could only spend what you had in your pocket. And so when we came up to this opportunity to purchase our building for our business, I immediately shut that down. I immediately said, that's not possible for us, because I don't have millions of dollars in my pocket to be able to spend on something like this. Never really taking the time to understand how loans work, right? And those are barriers that we bring with us into leadership and into the just work life that we operate in. And so if you don't understand that, you don't know how to work around that, and you don't know how to welcome that mindset into your daily operating lifestyle. So it's important as a leader to take the time to just understand, spend more time listening, spend more time giving, and then you'll see how you can actually make the change. And so within the first year, what we did, for going back to how we shifted our gender ratio, we hit 50-50 gender ratio the next year by shifting the way we approached our work, right? Instead of expecting women to come to us, we went to them. We started holding campaigns. So we learned by being a part of women's groups that women like to go to places and enter new places in groups. So we held more group events. We upped our events. We expanded programming to, or expanded initiatives to do like a buy one, get one, or bring a friend. these kinds of things. And then we engaged that community. We went to them, right? We participated in those events, but we started with listening first. The second piece around underrepresented communities, that's much deeper, and that requires listening as well. And as I was saying, there's barriers around how we deal with money that's very different than the rest of the population. And so that piece we worked heavily on by expanding really into creating our own nonprofit organization and building a huge focus around underrepresented communities and the needs, removing the barriers and de-risking entrepreneurship there for them. And again, that started with listening. So measuring that impact led to us then defining what we wanted to see in the future, which was, can we make our entrepreneur ecosystem look and feel like the greater ecosystem that exists in Arizona? And that's our one goal for the next 10 years. So measuring is number 2. Integration is number 3. So yes, you can paint your walls. Yes, you can define your mission. Yes, you can spend the time thinking and listening and identifying what changes you can make. But now you need to integrate. You need to take the time to train your team. When we shifted to focusing on women, not so much as like only allowing women, but we wanted to start shaping our community to show that what exists outside is also what exists inside our 4 walls. And so we trained our team to really address women's needs. That meant me sitting with my team and saying, if a woman walks through our doors, you have to answer these 3 questions about that woman, right? Like, and what that ended up resulting in was a system that applied for all. Whether you're a male or a female that walks through our doors, we need to understand what your challenges are as a business. We need to understand what your business is, and we need to spend the time to think about how we can connect you to resources. These were the 3 goals, but they only came about because these were the things that we heard women needed the most, right? They weren't coming into our space necessarily looking for space. They were coming into our space looking for solutions to some of their problems. And so we developed essentially a tour process that requires hitting those things. And it sounds so simple, but I've toured hundreds of co-working spaces and very few of them even ask those questions. Another tactical thing we started doing was discussing on a weekly basis things that we could do to improve equity, right? To bring more women to the table. Like, how do women and underrepresented communities, if we know that these are barriers, how do we start addressing them? And asking our own employees to also bring those issues to the table. If they see something happening, they should be bringing that to the table, and encouraging that piece of it. So that was another piece. And then creating systems to actually measure. Going back to number 2, if you want to make this change, you have to be able to measure that change. And so we started just measuring how many people come through our doors, right? How many women and underrepresented communities are we serving at our events? Again, elevating the shared lived experiences is a big piece of that too. Representative leadership, it's not a bullet point here, but one of the biggest things we saw as we talked to more members that were moving into our space, and we're talking about customers, right, at this point, as we started to shape, like, not only our employees that we were hiring to be following that vision of a diverse leadership group, also our greater community of customers that we were bringing in became more diverse. And we asked each community member after they've joined what was the reason that they joined, and almost every underrepresented entrepreneur and entrepreneur of color said that the reason they joined was they saw somebody that looked like them in the space. And that's such an impactful piece that I think I personally knew. And I think every woman that walks into a space where it's all men will immediately pick up that they're the only woman. These are things that are very obvious to people who are underrepresented, but are often not seen when you come from not those communities, right? So it's important to see that and realize that that matters, right? Representation matters. And the last piece on this is instill those values at the front line. Every touch point in a physical sense you can do, right? Paint walls, talk about it, put it in all your marketing materials. But if your front lines, your people that touch your customers, don't actually exude those values, then you're not going to get anywhere. And so integration across all touch points was where we kind of started, where we moved into as the third element. So the fourth element that we really did that shifted the work that we do is elevate, right? We know that there's centers of power. I often say it's like the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon in the world of entrepreneurship and connections. The 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon is right. Like for for those of you who don't know that term, it's you. There's always like 7 people between you to Kevin Bacon. And the world that we live in today, in terms of your access to the people that will drastically change your world and your business, is 7 degrees, unless you come from communities of color who don't have readily access to that huge network of people. And so our co-working space is one of those centers of power where you immediately connect in, and then you are connected to all these huge resources, right? And so we can be a group that expands power to all these different communities, right? And we've always said, actually, my friend Pam Slim, who's an amazing leader in Arizona and works in inclusion heavily, has said something that has always been close to my heart, and that was, if we build programming to support the most marginalized, we build programming that will support everyone. And so if you look at what you're doing and how you elevate even the most marginalized, or elevate the people that are often invisible to the leadership group, if you elevate those people, if you nominate them for awards, if you bring them on boards, if you look at them for panelist positions, yes, they have to be qualified. Of course they're qualified, but they bring such amazing talents to your board and awards and visibility that it opens up so many more opportunities for other people who never thought that it was possible. And so creating centers of power and getting more people closer to those centers of power. Understand your privilege. Again, going back to what you have, what your lived experience is a lens that you see that's unique to you. But understand there's all different kinds of equity that we need to build, right? There's class equity, there's race equity, there's gender equity, and inequities around that needs to be shifted. So realize where you come from, where you stand in your position of privilege, everybody has it, and how you can support others in uplifting them. Make an effort to understand that representation matters, right? I feel like we talk about these things all the time. We talk about, why aren't there enough women on panels? Why aren't there enough people of color on panels? But you have to actually make the effort to nominate people to be on panels. Like, people build panels around people that they know, and you congregate with people that you know personally. And until we start to mesh those different communities, we won't see that change happen. So as a person of color, we need to nominate more people of color into awards, right? And as a person who's maybe building the panels and the awards, think about who you know that can break into these communities that you just haven't had access to before, and build your panels off of that. And then the last element is, make this a weekly habit, right? Take the time when you see awards that are coming out to nominate somebody else that is not somebody that typically gets nominated, right? Take the time at a weekly meeting to think about how you can shift the way that your organization operates right now to be more inclusive, right? Make sure that if you look around your table and a woman hasn't spoken in a while, that you give them the space to be able to speak, or shift how you handle monthly events, right? So take the time, dedicate the time to work on these things. And so I think I'm out of time now. The last thing I will leave you with is, as a leader, you're all leaders in your organizations and at different levels. You are responsible for instilling a culture of inclusion. Do so responsibly, do so with passion, do it honestly, and you can make drastic, amazing change for our communities. And so I love to connect with people. If you have something you want to connect with me on, I'm at Poon on pretty much every social media platform. I'm not on TikTok, but every other social media platform I'm on there. You can email me directly. You can find more information about our workspace, our purpose-driven workspace, as well as me personally at the website here. And I'd love to connect with anybody who's interested in talking more about this.